response officially, and are they willing to accept the ceasefire unconditionally?
Well, I mean, we don't know the answer to the last question. That's what we want to know, whether they're prepared to do it unconditionally. We'll have contact with them today. There's already been contacts at different levels with counterparts, different members of the administration, and that'll continue. But as far as the Russian reaction to it, that's really the question here. And that is, this was a few hours old. We're going to bring it to them directly. We're going to say that Ukraine is prepared to stop all battlefield activity and begin the immediate process of negotiating an enduring end to the war. And we'll see what their response is. If their response is yes, then we know we've made real progress and there's a real chance of peace. If their response is no, it would be highly unfortunate and it would make their intentions clear. So that's what we're hoping to hear from them. And obviously, as I said, that this was not prearranged for them. So they're probably processing the news the same as the rest of the world is. So we hope to have a positive answer from them. The ball is truly in their court.
Mr. Secretary, Nike Chin with the Voice of America. What would be a good G7 joint statement on Russia and on China?
Well, I think the perfect statement would be that the United States has done a good thing for the world and bringing this process forward, and now we all eagerly await the Russian response and urge them strongly to consider ending all hostilities so people will stop dying, so bullets will stop flying, and so a process can begin to find a permanent peace. I think the first step in all this is the acceptance that there is no military solution to this conflict. Neither side can militarily achieve their maximalist gains, their maximalist goals. Neither side can achieve them through the military side. The only way this conflict can end is through negotiation. That's the only way you're going to have peace, is through negotiation. And so we need to start that process. And it is hard to start a process when people are shooting at each other and people are dying. And so our hope is that we can stop that, all these hostilities, and get to a negotiating table where both sides, over some period of time with a lot of hard work, can find a mutually acceptable outcome that, in the case of Ukraine, obviously secures their long-term prosperity and security.
Mr. Secretary, could you just update us on Mr. Witkoff's plans for Moscow and whether he'll be meeting with President Putin? And then separately, if you wouldn't mind elaborating on something that Mr. Waltz said yesterday about the specifics that you discussed with the Ukrainians about what the end of the war would look like. You had mentioned we're not going to get maps out and draw lines, but did you actually talk about territorial concessions?
Well, we had conversations. As far as Steve's trip, I'm not here to, I'm not going to make any announcements about specific dates, times, or even confirm such a trip. Suffice it to say there's going to be multiple points of contact with the Russians to gauge, are they willing to do this or not? And as far as the conversations that were yesterday, yeah, when you sit down with a counterpart like Ukraine, we're not going to negotiate this publicly. We're not going to actually put out there sort of what we talked about, because in any negotiation, there's certainly an element where you don't want one side to be giving away all this leverage from a public perspective. We had a broad conversation about what it would, but I think the bulk of our conversation was what a negotiation process would look like in terms of not the specific conditions, but rather the timing of it, sort of the steps they would like to see taken. The Ukrainians made very clear that this isn't just about ending a war. They need to get their prisoners of war back. They need to get the children back. They'd like to see an exchange of prisoners of war. They'd like to see their children back. So there's all sorts of things tied to the humanitarian assistance is important as well. There are areas of Ukraine that have been badly damaged that require immediate assistance. So these are the sorts of things that we talked about as being inclusive in the negotiation process. So really the bulk of our conversation when we got to that stage of it was discussing the kinds of items that need to be on a negotiation agenda, even when we hopefully get there.
He also mentioned security guarantees, which is something that there has been some reluctance for the administration to elaborate on. Are you committing to security guarantees?
I think the point to understand is that we're looking at is securing their long-term. What we want to see, like any country in the world, Ukraine wants their long-term security. They want to make sure that this doesn't happen again. We all do. I mean, what is the point of spending all this time to get a ceasefire, hopefully, and then a negotiated end of the war, only to see it re-spark up again in about 6 years, 4 years, 3 years? We're not interested in that, and they certainly aren't either. So I think the question really is more about a deterrence. Can Ukraine create a sufficient deterrent against future aggression, against future attack, against future invasion? Because every country in the world has a right to defend themselves. and no one can dispute that. So that will most certainly have to be part of the conversation. But again, I don't think there isn't a peace to secure until you have a peace. But there's no way to have an enduring peace without the deterrence piece being a part of it.
Can I just follow up on that particular
Yes.
point? Because the joint statement talks about European partners being involved in the peace process, but that's only attributed to the Ukrainian delegation. There doesn't appear to be US support.
Well, I think
for
what
that
it
line.
says in the statement is that they raised the need for the Europeans. But I've already said publicly, the Europeans have issued a series of sanctions against the Russian Federation. And I would imagine that in any negotiation, if we get there, hopefully, with the Russians, that they will raise these European, the European sanctions that have been imposed upon them. So I think that the issue of European sanctions are going to be on the table, not to mention what happens with the frozen assets and the like. And so I think it's self-evident that for there to be a peace in Ukraine, at the end of that process, there's going to have to be some decision made by the Europeans about what they're going to do with these sanctions and so forth. And so that's why I think they have to be necessarily involved in this regard. Now, whether they're involved at the front end of it or at the back end of it, it'll have to play itself out. And then obviously there's also all sorts of security promises that European countries have made to Ukraine, that will also be, I imagine, a part of this conversation as we move forward. So we don't disagree with that statement. I think the statement just reflects that they raised it.
Could you back European peacekeepers in Ukraine, which is something Russia is
Well,
categorically...
we'll see. I mean, there's different ways to construct a deterrent on the ground that prevents another war from starting in the future. We're not going to go in with any sort of preconceived notion. The bottom line is it needs to be something that makes Ukraine feel as if they can deter and prevent a future invasion. How that looks and how that's put together, that's what we're going to be talking about. If we can get to that stage. Again, right now we're just trying to get to the stage where there's actual diplomacy happening. Here's what we'd like the world to look like in a few days. Neither side is shooting at each other. Not rockets, not missiles, not bullets, nothing, not artillery. The shooting stops, the fighting stops, and the talking starts. That's what we want to see. What happens during that talking and how that evolves, I think we're going to have to be flexible and nimble and creative and patient and work hard at it and hopefully turn it into something that's concrete. You've covered, many of you have covered foreign policy for years. That's how these things happen, and they're not easy, and sometimes they're difficult to predict which way they're going to go in terms of the specifics of it. But we just want to get to that stage. That would be, for lack of a better term, a good problem to have to figure out how to negotiate a peace, because we're actually negotiating a peace while the shooting is stopped.
Is the mineral deal essentially the security guarantee that